Hi, and welcome to Metaconscious Leaders. My guest today is Shawne Mitchell, a transcendental leadership coach, consultant, author, and speaker, recognized as an expert in bridging conscious living with a spiritual lifestyle. In addition, Shawne holds a master's degree in consciousness studies from the University of Philosophical Research in Los Angeles and a degree in communications from the University of Washington, Seattle. Shawne has practiced transcendental meditation for 40 years, worked for the Brazilian National Institute of Space Research, and also Captain Edgar Mitchell's Institute of Noetic Sciences. She is the author of a number of books, and most notably, for the purposes of today's conversation, Transcendental Leadership, a narrative on conscious leadership, highlighting and showcasing leadership that is aligned with a state of being informed by universal wisdom. In this book, she sets out profound principles with a practical mindset and demonstrates their vital relevance to leaders in this era of monumental change and challenge. So welcome, Shawne, to Metaconscious Leaders, and thank you so much for being our guest today.
Well, thank you too, Greg. I'm acknowledged to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Shawne, shall we jump straight in with your wonderful book? Let me just share it here.
Thank you.
Transcendental Leadership. I first read this a couple of years ago, and ever since then I wanted to talk to you about it because it resonated so deeply and still does resonate with me so deeply. And I do really recommend it to people. Would you say something about it from your point of view in terms of what it is, why the book, why now, its relevance for leaders today? And then we'll go a little bit backwards into your story and how you've got here. But the relevance of the book, I think, up front might be very useful.
Well, thank you. That book came out now. Here we are in 2025. And I believe it was, was it 2023 or 2022? At a certain point, it's wonderful for me to kind of go back and take a look, because oftentimes I know as we evolve, we're moving forward. And sometimes I'm not necessarily thinking about what I wrote. So when I go back and look at it, it's like my heart kind of soars again, because the way it came about is it originally was the thesis for my master's in consciousness studies. And I had written in early 2004, I had written some books on sacred space and feng shui and so on. And during my master's, when I had to go and, speak to the dean and so on, what are you going to do your dissertation thesis on and so forth, I thought, I could do something, easy breezy on sacred space. And somehow or another, I don't know where it came from, but I got this download about transcendental leadership as a title and as a notion of sorts. And during our meeting in Los Angeles, I said, I could do something on sacred space, but I could also do something. I got this notion of transcendental leadership. I mean, he was just like, do that. And at the time I was thought, this is going to be like bigger than I expected, right? Maybe not so easy. And yet when I started to get into it, I was really, I want to say, somewhat informed, I'm going to say, when I did the thesis. And as you can well understand, at that time, it had to be an academic paper. And that meant, references upon references upon, it was an academic paper. Fast forward, after I got the degree, which was somewhere around, I'm going to say it was 2013, I, moved on with my life. I was working for retreat centers in Santa Barbara, Italy, and so forth. The thesis would kind of live over here on my shoulder, and every once in a while it would say, I want to be a book. And if anyone's written a dissertation, it's like, go away. Do not want to do. And, later on it would, I want to be a, go away. I want to be a, no, go, that's a nice way of what I was actually saying to that little voice. But then when COVID hit, of course, and we were all in lockdown, I want to be a book. And I was like, well, maybe we can talk about that now. And I went to a woman who had been an editor for me when I had done the earlier books on sacred space and feng shui. And she helped me. I want to give her credit that she helped me reconstruct what had been an academic paper into a book. And one of the things about the book that I also want to give a shout out to is during all those, 8 years in between writing the thesis and writing the book, I had met so many individuals who I would, in the world, I'll say mostly in the United States and in Europe, that I considered to be individuals who imbued those traits of what I would call a being informed by a transcendent relationship with universal wisdom, let's call it, in leading their organizations. And so one of the things I did for the book, as you noticed, is that I interviewed lots of people and was able to kind of put their perspectives and how they were informed and how they utilized their I'm going to call it alignment to source or universal wisdom, or however you might want to call that, presence, God, spirit, that's available for all of us, and how that informed the doing by their being and leadership, right? And then I was also very fortunate that Joseph Jaworski, who, if you're not familiar with him, gosh, maybe back in 2000 or something, he was leading a brilliant organization and leadership, and he wrote a book called Presence, and he wrote a book called Source, and he wrote a book called The Synchronicity of Leadership. And his books were great resources for when I was writing my book. And God bless him and his assistant, Susan Taylor. They wrote the foreword to my book. And I mean, I was just so acknowledged. He was like the personification of someone who was I really got what he was trying to say. So maybe I've said a bit too much there, but that's more or less how it originally came about.
And it struck me over and over again reading it, Shawne, that it is so relevant and so applicable and so needed in this day. And when you were writing it and when you were putting it out, I think that was probably very much on your mind, wasn't it? Because these teachings, if I can call it that, this knowledge, this language about transcendental leadership, which is the word that you give to it, is so relevant in terms of where we are now and where leadership is now, which is having to face increasingly complex and sometimes very difficult challenges that are not just business challenges, but they're embedded in society as well. They don't always have control over the issues that they're facing. And yet the transcendental leadership provides the tools, I think, to at least act in that space wisely.
So the way originally the book was put together is I incorporated what I would call the foundational pillars, if you will, of the Masters in Consciousness studies. And the curriculum included all the wisdom traditions of the world. So we needed to study all of those. And then that was one of the curriculums or pillars, if you will. And then another one was philosophy from the ancient Greeks, the fragments, all the way through to, Kantian, perennial, Emerson, whom I truly, truly love, a transcendental movement in the United States in the 80s. And then another pillar of the curriculum was psychology, spiritual psychology, Maslow, Jungian, so on and so on. And then also another one, which was candidly hard for me to get my head around, but I can say that I have a fair understanding now of some quantum physics. And so now we're talking about Amit Goswami and Alan Aspect's experiments, the Schrodinger's cat experiments, entanglement theory, and so on and so forth, that was Christian de Quincey, who was my professor. Brilliant work in terms of understanding that potentially the ground of being is consciousness. And that really was, for me, I thought, well, when we can put the science together with these, let's call them spiritual notions that have been written since, the Gita and the Upanishads and the underlying truths of, I'm going to say, around what Jesus had to say before it got, it became a dogmatic institution. It was, and what the Greeks had to say. And when they all came back to it being awakened, and from that point of view, and my own transcendental meditation practice, I found that when we're informed by an alignment with transcendent states, it imbues our being, which informs our doing. And it's pretty kind of a basic way to look at it. It sounds complex in one way, but on the other hand, the simple bottom line, in my opinion, is that as an individual, if we can discover or learn the contemplative practices, let's call it, that resonate for ourselves and gain some, I'm going to use the word muscle or practice, that's why they're called practices, right? That more often we become more those traits, if you will, of compassion and peace and emotional balance and love, bottom line, informs just who we are in our lives, regardless of whether we're literally a leader of an organization or we're raising our children or we're just not just, but member of our community and society. Who are we being in all the things that we're doing? And so clearly, our world's in chaos. And when I wrote the book, it was in crazy town, and now we're in chaos. I mean, it's worse. And I'm going to say, and I don't want to do too much of the talking because I want to have a shared dialogue here, but I want to say it was in the 70s, maybe ish, when, I have to kind of speak from a United States sort of mindset because I am not like a big business major, but I have been in business. There became this sharehold supremacy theory. And before we knew it, and prior to that, when we discovered, maybe it was in the 40s, I'm going to say, or the 50s, when we learned that war was a good business and we could sell weapons, that plus the corporate supremacy, and now we've got the advertising telling us, buy, we've got to create more, more was good. But things just got crazier and crazier. And particularly after the pandemic, as we saw so many people lose their jobs, lose their homes. Now, on top of things in the United States, for sure, because of the way our systems are set up, we have tragic homelessness. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of all our problems, but yes, it is. Do we need leaders who are informed from spirit, love, compassion, the well-being, service to all from a place of awareness and wisdom? Now more than ever. And we're such a global society that from a critical mass theory, and here we have this incredibly, oddly intimate forum of Zoom and YouTube, and that people can express these needs. And I feel that even though that our news is frightening for the most part, and we don't even know half the shenanigans going on in the world, I think that there's an underlying, not so underlying anymore, movement of this isn't working and people are more interested. Granted, people, I'm going to say like us, were privileged enough to not be in complete survival at the moment. So we can have these conversations. We can have a contemplative practice. We can help be the being that helps inform our doing, that can be loving and compassionate in our world. I mean, I'm singing to the choir here a little bit. I understand that, but I'll say enough.
Well, Shawne, can we go back to the beginning here and to what you've mentioned, philosophy? Now, when one mentions philosophy, I think a lot of people will kind of glaze over and think of Aristotle and whatever it may be. But it is fundamental to the meaning that we derive from the world and our existence, and upon which we then build our beliefs and our actions and so forth. And every civilization has been based upon its philosophy. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, and now our current dominant worldview, arising from curiously named enlightenment. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Because you talk right at the beginning about your book as because it's the perspective, it's the context that everything happens in. So this is materialism and where that's led us, and the alternatives that arise out of the new sciences.
If we go back to Heraclitus and some of the ancient, the Greek philosophers that we're familiar with, and of course, we're not going to have the statements exact because, were these fragments and, the writings or they passed down. But they did a lot of deep thinking, right? They were philosophical thinkers. They wanted to talk. They were into deep inquiry, which of course deep inquiry is sort of where, the Buddhist philosophy comes from too. And from that, it all came down to the same stuff in terms of Hinduism and Buddhism and the Greeks is that, awaken within my inner nature. The inner nature, when we are deeply contemplative, we find that oneness, like Edgar Mitchell discovered when he was coming back from space, that samadhi, that experience of transcendence where a person experiences oneness with everything. I'm going to say that, and see, I'm not a historian either, but at some point and I think you said imperialism, wherever fear got caught up in this whole thing, and I need to have more, I need to have a bigger country, I need to be with my own kind, and all of those notions, little by little by little by little, and sometimes there might have been sort of a leap like in the axial ages, that humanity became more fearful, and particularly in states in terms of survival, depending.
But since the Enlightenment, we've really got into a materialistic mindset, which has become very fervently established, not just in the culture, but it's embedded in economic systems, in law, in societal processes, and so forth. And if I can just read a bit from your book, you say here, it's a worldview that has been one of materialistic separation and its perspective of an inherently meaningless and randomly evolved universe has determined mechanistic and reductionist approaches that are no longer sustainable and have become existentially dangerous. And then you go on to talk about the quantum science and what you mentioned a little bit earlier about being arising from consciousness, or I forget what the precise words you used, but us being excitations, if you like, of the field of potentiality, that kind of language. Would you say something a little bit about that? Because that's something that is in your consciousness area, and you've, as you say, you spent a little time with the science of it as well, I think.
I want to be careful about saying I understand the science because I want to, maybe I don't entirely understand all the science, so I don't want to, but at the same time, it feels like it resonates, and it feels to me as if, yeah, everything is one. And so for me, from that point, is that my field and everyone else's field is connected. And if we look at subatomic particles and what we're made up of and what everything is made up of, then it's mostly nothing. And all these random little, atoms and molecules that are actually mixing with everything else. So, my computer or my pen or whatever, all that stuff is interweaving, and it is Shawne's perspective of reality that makes up this life form and what it is and what it looks like in its life, as opposed to the telephone or you or anything else. From that perspective, for me, then I can see that there's a mystery, but I'm like really curious and open about that mystery and the extraordinary connection. And then we have learned from physics that, something that is happening on the other side of the world, like you and I were talking about the other day, can affect the energy fields and consciousness of, and not just people, but of circumstances. And so if that science is accurate, and we're learning all the time, of course, we've got the theoretical physicists and we've got the other kinds of physicists and so on, so on, so on. if that stuff's accurate, then what else, I mean, how interesting too. I guess this is a little goofy layer to lay on top of it, but I mean, artificial intelligence and extraterrestrials showing up at the same time. What's that all about? Not that I don't feel that extraterrestrials haven't been around for quite a while, probably. Probably. I don't know. But isn't that's a whole other like, and if you're familiar with the telepathy tapes, and if you're not, I would suggest going online and checking that out because allegedly, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, but allegedly, non speaking, many non speaking autistic people are actually talking to each other in a realm that we're unaware of, and not only are they talking to each other, they can talk to their caregivers and teachers who are hearing them. It's fascinating. I encourage you to go check out this whole thing called the telepathy tapes. They're telepathic, and they're supposedly, I want to say allegedly, telepathic in realms we're unfamiliar with in our current mindset.
See,
So
that what the thing that comes to mind there, Shawne, is that we're all telepathic, and they rely heavily on their telepathy. They probably, and I'm going on the alleged piece, and on that basis, it makes sense to me. I wouldn't think that it was impossible. I would think it was plausible because we are all telepathic, but we're not always noticing it. And a lot of the time, our telepathy and our sense, our sixth sense, is blinded or obscured by our focus on a bunch of ideas and thoughts that we project onto the world. And when you bring this into leadership, and I think that the message here for leaders is that telepathy is something that's happening all the time, and a lot of communication is telepathic. We get a feeling of somebody and they get a feeling of us. We get a sense that somebody is coming to us with bad news, or even we get a sense that somebody is in our vicinity. In my early 20s, I met a senior director of a retail company with whom I connected very quickly. We didn't have very much contact, but there was very clearly a connection between us. 7 years later, I had very little contact with her. 7 years later, I was crossing the channel, English Channel, on a ferry, and she walked past me. And I said, "Wow, Sue." And she carried on walking. And I went after her, I said, "Sue," and I tapped her on the shoulder. And she looked at me blankly. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong person. I'm sorry." 3 days later, I was walking out of 3 days later, I was walking out of Regent's Park Zoo, and Sue passed me. And I thought, I'm not going there again. And I carried on walking. And this voice came from behind me, Greg. And I turned around, she said, "Have you forgotten me?" And so what was that? There was a connection. There was a 7-year gap. And at some point, there was the way I see it, there was some sense that she was coming into my orbit. What is that if it's not telepathy? So it's one of the ambitions for metaconscious leaders is to bring this into the normal discourse so that we can acknowledge that these things happen and then utilize them for beneficial purposes and reasons within a leadership context. And that enriches leadership, it enriches the output, and it gives more meaning to what we do as leaders and what we do in business. And my feeling is that business, so much of what happens on the planet now is of a commercial nature. Decisions are made for commercial reasons. And it's one of the big ruptures, if you like, between business interests and societal interests, and yet they are interdependent. And transcendental leadership, metaconscious leadership, it's kind of pointing in the same direction, is a way that I think can be a force for good because of, a lot of the things you talk about in your book. Do you see things similarly?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If we don't incorporate, and I'm going to use the term spiritual, but you can also, wisdom, love, compassion, if we don't integrate these important elements of just societal well being and planetary well being into our worldview and how we, not just how we lead, but the systems that we create, it's just not sustainable. And we know that with what's happening to our planet and what's happening to so many societies. Like I said, we see the news, but the news we don't see in many parts of the world, it's just a heartbreak what's happening in so many countries.
Hmm.
Somebody just doesn't figure that that's as newsworthy, or maybe there isn't as much commercial money in that news. I don't know. But we can't keep being a consuming society the way that we have been. And we know that, that the quote haves and have nots. It's getting further and further and further and further and further and further apart. And candidly, we all know that. And wasn't there some research about, in the United States, I'm going to say that 70 or $80,000 salary, or income a year was the happy quotient. You were good. You had, quote, enough. Now that might have changed in the last few years, but the point was it wasn't like, $500 million a year.
Yeah.
It has to change. And if it doesn't change in a more loving, compassionate manner, I'm not sure what's going to happen to our society. Empires have come and gone, but epochs of our planet have come and gone, and maybe that's what's going to happen to us.
So the sense that I have is that transcendental leadership and metaconscious leaders is pointing towards being rather than doing. We have, and a materialistic outlook points to doing and having and getting and protecting, whereas being points to oneness, collaboration rather than competition, and qualities that bring happiness. It's well documented, the crisis that we're in, but many of the solutions, certainly that are rolled out by governments, by corporations, by the culture at large, if I can call it that, are ones about action, are ones about what we need to do. Whereas unless we change who we are, who we perceive ourselves to be, unless we change the meaning that we put on the world, it doesn't make any difference what we're going to do. You take energy. We could be, let's say we were gifted free energy. Let's say fusion energy was magically available to everyone. Everybody had free energy and there was no pollution. In my view, we would destroy the planet in double quick time because it would enable us to keep on doing everything that we've ever dreamed of. But see, we haven't got the wisdom to go with that because we've lost connection with the environment and with the natural world that is our home. So for me, transcendental leadership and metaconscious leadership is about looking at who we are, looking at what the nature of our being is, because unless we do that, we'll just carry on down the same path, which is cataclysmic or going in that direction.
I hear what you're saying. However, I would reframe a little bit what you said about the being and the doing, because the way I see it is our being forms our doing no matter what. Chapter 4 in my book, and one of the things that's my kind of current thing these days is that for Shawne to, let's call it, develop her being, and Shawne's journey is to the degree possible, align herself with God, spirit, source, presence, divine wisdom, universal wisdom, and so on. And what are the things, and I said this earlier, what are those practices? I call them portals personally, those practices that help Shawne inform her doing with compassion and love and wisdom and awareness. And for me, they've changed over my life a little bit, but I'm going to name a few of them. And meditation, or what I might call a contemplative practice, those practices that we go into silence, we go within, and from a deeper experience, we connect with those states of transcendence, they're called. Now, nature is another one of those portals. We can talk about that all, in Gaia, here in our earth. I mean, our earth is holy, right? We don't treat our earth we don't treat the cosmos like it's holy. Okay, so then I'll use another category is what I call movement. And that can be yoga, qigong, conscious dance, running, lots of different kinds of sports activities. When I was younger, horseback riding, snow skiing, and water skiing, for me, was a movement and a nature experience that I could be in completely blissed out in another state of experience. It helped that I got good at it, and that way you could just sort of like be one with the experience as opposed to novice learning. But then there's creativity, right? Music and art. Great art, great music. Those composers and artists, they lose track of time, right? They become lost. It's when they get this download, right? And then, of course, there's what I call inspired writing, with the Gita, and for some people, the Bible, or the Upanishads, or Emerson again, or Mary Oliver, all these wonderful poets. I'm inspired nowadays by inspired writings, and for some people, it's devotion, right? There's all kinds of groups that are in deep devotion and access and I could go on. There's more than that handful. But the bottom line is I truly believe that each and every single one of us, if we can help each other find a couple of those practices, we can begin to get a feeling and a hearing and a sensibility of alignment with the great wisdom, the great traditions, that awareness, that presence, that love, that compassion. And automatically, I truly believe that automatically that will inform our doing. And we know those people. We know those ones that walk the planet right now. Are they perfect people? No, they're not perfect people. But we know them. We could name a few. And they're not just the spiritual teachers that are walking the planet nowadays. There are all kinds of folks in your life, I'm sure, that person that who's just got this presence and demeanor about them that's, lovely to be around. In any event, that's my bottom line. So that back to when I was saying I'd like to reframe the being and the doing. Automatically, I truly believe this, almost automatically, if a person develops their inner self, and it doesn't have to be heady, it doesn't have to be in the mind, it really needs to be in the heart. Love, when I say in the heart, it will automatically begin to transform how we do everything that we do. It'll transform the people around us. It'll transform how we work in our societies and communities and in our leadership. It's sort of simplistic in some ways, I can imagine, but it's kind of how I see it. I believe that source, again, source, God, spirit, presence, universal consciousness,
there are many different words, but they point to the same thing.
It just wants, because how can we not be part of it? It's everything. Just wants to express itself in service through the vehicle that Shawne is right now in this particular life, and you and everybody else. That's all it is. And it kind of takes the pressure off. You don't have to accomplish. You don't have to have a degree. You don't have to be a big wig or anything. That's all it is. Can we get to, and you know what? We're just going to be happier because we're not going to feel like we need. We're not going to feel like we're not enough. We're not going to feel like, I'm not, and how come? And I'm in fear because we're spoon-fed fear every single day in order to buy, get more, have more. I can't say that I don't have fears. And of course, life has its, we get sick, people we love get hurt. There's lots of things to deal with, lots of challenges, but can we find some surrender and trust in that we're aligned with this incredible, extraordinary life experience that's, like you said, this pulsing energy field? I don't have it figured out. It's a mystery, but I'm super curious, and that's the part I'm grateful that I'm curious.
Curiosity is a superpower, I believe. There's a saying, I probably won't get this completely right, that comes from Buddhism, which is that there is one truth, and wise people speak of it in many ways. So the religions, many spiritual teachers, they point to the same thing, but they express it differently. They use different language. And, when I work with leaders and work with people, to me, it's very clear that everybody is in some way, at some point in time, in some context, transcendental. They are operating at a higher level, but it's something that happens almost kind of quietly, unobtrusively, and then the mind jumps back into getting something done or chasing some ambition or chasing some dream. So it's not that we can't do it. It's not that we don't do it. It's that we get distracted. I think it's that we get distracted by things that are not really important, and indeed are things that undermine our ability to connect with that which makes us fulfilled, happy, peaceful, and all of those things. So you started, and this is another reason why I so love your book and would recommend that people get it and read it, you talked about the portals and how to start to build one's awareness in these areas. I remember working with a company, and I've been doing some work with the CEO, which had involved meditation, because he wanted to do meditation. And then I was working with a director of his, and his director started off with like, "And Greg, I don't want to do any of this meditation stuff. No, I don't want to do any of that." I said, "No problem. No problem." I didn't have it in mind, actually. It was just whatever it is for you. We had many great sessions. And then after about 6 or 9 months, he said, "Greg, what's this thing about meditation? Tell me about it." So I told him about it, and, my understanding of it, my experience of it. And he said, "I do that. That's what happens to me when I go running. After 5 kilometers, I'm in that space." And I said, "Brilliant. That's great." You know, we get there in different ways. There isn't a one track. We're all unique people. We're all unique beings, as well as people. We're all unique beings, and we have different journeys. We have different paths. And that's diversity. And that's to be celebrated. And that's how we learn from each other. So you mentioned the traits, because I want to bring this and connect this to leadership, because its practical application is what's so beautiful about your book. You talk about the traits of transcendental leaders as being wisdom, awareness, and service. Do you want to say a little bit more about those? Because I love all of them, especially the third one, which is leadership as a service.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your acknowledgement about the book. I really appreciate that very much. Well, when I was thinking, about the traits, and of course, traits were things like being able to, what I call, deep listening, like Bohemian dialogue. I mean, there's, the capacity to suspend judgment, the capacity to be uncertain, intuition, be inspiring, have a state of presence, some of those. But when I looked at all the kinds of what we might call traits slash, I want to be careful using soft skills. I mean, let me digress a teensy bit here too, because clearly in running an organization, you have to have what I'm going to call the hard skills. You need to there's marketing, and there's budgeting, and there's time management, and there's forecasting, and there's those skills that are also required. But I'm talking about the traits that I might call the soft skills, or candidly, I call them the deeper skills. And those are usually aspects, not just a personality, because we think of personality as one kind of thing, but elements that might be, authenticity and integrity. And so these things to me fall into these three categories. And in the book, I don't know, there's like 15 traits, but they can be part of this. They can be part of wisdom, and they might be part of awareness, and they might be part of serving others. Because, for example, a trait would be a leader who cares about the well-being of their employees, let's call it. I have a friend. I'm in this conscious leadership guild. I'm on the board, and she has an organization where she helps leaders with trauma. Now, she coaches leaders whether they've experienced severe trauma in their lives or they're helping an employee who is suffering trauma in their lives. Maybe they're being abused and what have you, right? This is a delicate skill, and it comes from the heart. Because leaders who don't have heart, they're just, produce, and I'm sorry about what's happening at home. In any event, so back to when I look at all those 12, 15 traits that I have in the book, they all come under wisdom. To me, a person who's a great leader cares about their personal capacity around wisdom. They're interested in their own journey.
What is wisdom for you, Shawne? What is wisdom?
Well, again, I feel that wisdom is part of that curiosity, that there is a greater spiritual element. And I'm going to use the word spiritual again. There's a greater spiritual element at work than Shawne knows about. And I am curious to learn and be informed by that. And then I would say wisdom is, again, also like the word nous, noetic sciences, like you were talking about earlier. What is out there? And I'm willing to learn. And part of that is a mystery. And understanding emotional balance, understanding emotional intelligence, wanting to be more emotionally intelligent. And I kind of equate wisdom and awareness there. Can I be more emotionally available to you or to whoever is speaking to me, and be quiet and a deep listener? Like you said, can you get the feelings of what they're saying as opposed to, or in addition to just what they're saying? So I guess that's how I could, go on and on and on, I guess. But to kind of get back to the wisdom, awareness, and service to others, I feel that when we have an intention about developing awareness and presence, like I really like Eckhart Tolle, for example, and all his teachings. I am a certified teacher of presence in his School of Awakening. Then people in our circle will find that energy very, peaceful and gentle and comfortable for them to feel, quote, safe. And if we're not serving, that's why I feel that that's the other trait. It all comes down to taking care of each other, helping each other, and, love again. But we need to help each other. We're all one anyway. So your suffering is my suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Eckhart Tolle, and I've spoken to a couple of people recently who said, "Oh, have you read this book, The Power of Now?" Yeah.
I've been grateful, blessed to, I'm sure wouldn't necessarily remember, but we're somewhat acquainted because I was living in Montecito, and he and his wife Kim were living there, or spent a lot of time living there as well. And I worked at a retreat center, so there was a fair amount of interaction here and there. But in 96, something I'm going to say like 1996-ish, that book came out. I read it. I was like, oh yes, I completely get this. This is 100% makes entire sense to me. And about within the month, I got something from Esalen, the retreat center in Big Sur, that Eckhart was going to be doing a weekend up there. I was on it immediately. And fast forward, I'm up at Esalen, and there's like 70 of us, if you can imagine, at the time. I mean, now it'd be like 3,000 people, right? And Kim, his wife, not at the time, but anyway, she's kind of doing recording, and we're just in a tent out on a big field. And I'm going to tell you that he is the real deal. No ego. And he has this energy field. He has a real energy field that if you're in that vicinity, well, sensitive at all. You would pass him on the street, not even like, who's that? Sorry, Eckhart. But and at the end of, I'll never forget, at the end of the weekend, someone asked if he'd be okay if, people wanted to hug him. And he's like, yes. And I remember hugging him, and he's like vibrating. And I turned to someone, what was that? And they just said, he's just got this frequency. And he'll tell the story, that it didn't come easily for him. He was on running off the cliff, so to speak. But I can't say enough. He is a great living teacher, I believe, right now. A great living teacher. Yeah. Yay, Eckhart. Gotta love him.
Can we round off the with a giving a little consideration to some of what I consider to be challenges that leaders are facing in these times, particularly in these times, I'd say. Meaning and purpose, I think we've covered that. Personal. So this question here, Shawne, is really if you could address a little bit about how transcendental leadership helps a leader in their personal well-being. And the kind of backdrop I've got in mind here is that there is meaning and purpose. There's also anxiety over a bunch of things, which may be climate change to stress about performance, decision making within a business where the agenda for the company is an agenda that is in conflict with perhaps some of the ethics or personal agenda that an executive may have but has to be set aside. I mean, all of these things affect our well-being, don't they? And yet I think that when we get into a transcendental frame of mind, when we focus on our being, then I think perhaps we have another way of looking at this, or another way of understanding and finding a wiser route. Is there anything you can say to that?
Well, I understand what you're talking about. There's a fine line between that paradox of having, goals and having a direction we want to take and accomplishing something, and surrendering to things are unfolding as they should. And I think that that's one of the things you're talking about to some degree, is a certain amount of, and I'm going to go back to the individual level again, as opposed to just the corporate level, because it's there too, because as within, so without kind of thing. And again, we're spoon fed fear and anxiety, and that keeps us propelling ahead. But I also believe that there's a certain amount of unfolding that is unfolding as it should. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have to pay my taxes and I don't have things to deal with. And I need, I have had, a third hip replacement because one of them went tank. That was a challenging episode. However, I've tried to, surrender to, cliche to use the word lesson, but, surrendering to this is here for you, Shawne. And on some weird level, I called this into existence. There's that whole element to fold in as well. But I do feel that it is sorry, my throat's kind of, in our world today, it is definitely difficult because it costs so much money to just have what we might consider to be a life that we can take care of ourselves and our families. And so many of us are in what I use the term survival to take care of ourselves and our families, paycheck to paycheck to paycheck. We're all familiar with this. And some of them, that we hardly have time to think about self-development, self-awareness, and so forth for the most part. And yet it's the critical thing. And until many of our leaders can see the bigger picture, and some of them are little by little by little, and they're finding that statistics and data and research are showing that, well, in this case, I'm going to use women-led organizations, and I'm using women-led because women, it's a generality, have some of those traits, let's call it, of, compassion and intuition and collaboration and so forth. But those, I could bring up some statistics that they have found, 2 to 3 times more productive, 2 to 3 times more, what's the word I want to say, return on investment, and so on. I also like to use the term return on impact. If this is what you wanted to, where you wanted to go, it's just a matter of, we really need to little by little by little by little inform, corporate leadership, and have more compassionate leaders, candidly, more women leaders, because the statistics and the data show that business is the lever, right? And they have to make money, shareholder supremacy again. But until, these CEOs can get off of, no, I need to have a, $10 million a year salary, but, this person who works at the bottom gets, $20 an hour. It's just not going to
So
work.
let me just give a shout out for the men
Yes,
in
we
this
have to have
conversation.
balance. We need a balance for sure.
In that, I'm not convinced that men lack compassion and women have compassion, but I will go along with women are probably more comfortable with showing compassion than men. And in a business environment, it's generally not, the culture is that you leave your emotions at the door when you sit down in your desk. And so I do quite a bit of emotional intelligence, a very good analytical thing, which is emotional capital report. And these are self-assessed emotional profiles, emotional intelligent profiles, which are then have a 360 aspect to them. It is amazing the number of CEOs who score low on compassion, on empathy, right? But it doesn't mean that they're not empathic. Back home, as parents or as husbands, they are empathic and very, can be very effective in that way. They just don't turn it on. They just don't use it. They don't see it as being necessary or appropriate, even within the work environment. And when their attention is moved towards that and they recognize that and they start to explore it and work with it, that then is a personal journey that can be very fulfilling because it opens them up. And of course, for all that we might think that we do compartmentalize our work life from our private life, we don't really. We can't. We are one being. and we're not really, we aren't successful schizophrenics whereby we can be one person and then completely different when we step on the other side of the line. I just that being a call out for male for the men amongst us.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think I said women led, not men.
Well, but I think what you're saying is correct, because what I said is that women are more comfortable showing and having empathy and using empathy. It's more in a woman's toolbox, if you like, rather than a men's toolbox. And culturally, it's more expected of women than of men.
I can appreciate that, what we might consider to be, the masculine energy, who has to report and keep up a certain, for the shareholders, that's its own struggle. And there may not be room for much empathy. And that's, I can see, is anyone's struggle, regardless of, gender identity. That can be a struggle when the shareholders have an expectation. But, how much is enough at a certain point? Again,
And the other thing is with emotional intelligence is that because you're empathic doesn't mean to say you don't make hard decisions. Doesn't mean to say you can't make very tough decisions. But if somebody needs to be let go, there are two ways. Well, there are many ways in which you can let someone go. At one end of the extreme, it's a very destructive, harmful experience for everybody concerned and is not a good advert for the company. At the other end, it can be done with a great deal of understanding, appreciation, and empathy. What is done is exactly the same. The action that it is taken is the same outcome, but the way in which it is done, one has a positive outcome, the other one has a very negative outcome. Emotional intelligence is not a brake on performance. It's actually a superpower. It makes a quantum difference in terms of the well-being of the leader and the well-being of all those that are being led.
I really appreciate, Greg, that you asked me on your podcast today. I'd love to explore some of this again, further at some point. It kind of occurred to me earlier today that it might be fun to, pick a couple, a chapter maybe, and then we could like deep into, a chapter on this or that, and then, maybe not as lengthy as this, and then, do a deep dive in a different chapter, like one on the philosophy or one on the portals or one on the traits. And that way we could, yeah, like I say, have a deeper dive, and maybe sometime in the future that would be kind of fun to do. But I really appreciate you.
I love that idea, Shawne. I love that idea because it gives us the opportunity to make it practically applicable.
Mm.
And that's something that very much I want to do with metaconscious leaders, because another thing about leaders is they haven't got much time, or we haven't got much time. And so, a long podcast with lots of different topics is kind of, it's nice to have, but it's not always possible to listen to it. And actually having small clips that are focused in on a particular aspect is a really effective way of communicating a message and enabling people to dip their toe in the water and go, aha. And gradually, yeah, it seeps into one's being.
Well, in addition, I'm thinking too, now that we're speaking, is that, how can I assist you is, yes, I'm a coach and a speaker and an author, but some of the people that I interviewed for my book who have organizations and businesses, maybe they would be individuals that you could have on your, and I'd be on your podcast, and I'd be happy make an introduction and see if they would be up for talking about how they incorporate their qualities and traits of a transformational leader in their organizations.
Thank you, Shawne. I will take a look in your book with a different with another aspect in mind.
Yeah,
So that's very kind of you.
sure.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, I would love to repeat this. I think the format you've just suggested is an interesting way of looking at it. Until then, Shawne, go well, God bless, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you too, Greg. And thank you for, the dialogue as opposed to just, I'm supposed to do most of the speaking. I really appreciate having the back and forth.
Me too. Thank you.
Thanks too.
Go well. Be well.